Welcome to Commissioner's Corner. I'm your host, Lois Leonard, and on behalf of everyone here at Boston City TV, we thank you for joining us. While not coming to you from our studio, we are with you remotely to share some very important progress that's been made at City Hall. At a time when many believe we need it the most, a new cabinet has been created, the Equity and Inclusion Cabinet. Let's listen as Mayor Walsh introduces the city's first Chief of Equity.
So the Chief of Equity is going to be somebody with a significant influence on how to operate as the city is moving forward. This is an extremely important appointment, an important moment right now for the city of Boston. We need somebody who can hit the ground running, someone who understands, not just knows the community, but understands the community, someone who understands city government and how City Hall works. And I'm confident that we have found the right person to lead this work. I am pleased to announce today Boston's first ever Chief of Equity is Dr. Karilyn Crockett.
Dr. Crockett, it is a pleasure to meet you. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, Lois, thanks for having me.
Certainly. Dr. Mayor Walsh has declared racism a public health crisis in Boston. I'd love to hear your reaction to that statement.
Sure. A timely statement, a true statement. We know that in this country for hundreds and hundreds of years, since the institutionalization of slavery, we have been dealing with a society organized by hierarchy and by race. And so to call out racism as a public health crisis just lets us put the attention, the scrutiny, the focus on an issue which is really ripping through and has been ripping through the very fiber of our society, our nation, and our city. So kudos to Mayor Walsh for having the vision and the tenacity and the commitment to call out this toxin, this disease that we must dislodge and uproot.
And it's interesting. Slavery was hundreds of years ago, but here we are today discussing this very subject. And we weren't a year ago, we weren't 2 years ago, we weren't making it such a focus. So throughout our interview today, I would like us to discuss a little bit more about that and how it's come to be an issue today, and this is that it's happening today. So, but without holding you to it, I would like to ask what your first 100-day plan would be if you had one. There's much to be done. Yes. So what would your first priority be?
Absolutely. Well, my priority is to make sure we have a clear and shared understanding of what equity is. So as the Chief of Equity, I have to begin with a clear understanding of what we're up to. And I understand that equity is a very popular word right now, almost a buzzword. It's everywhere. It's on many people's tongues. But without an understanding of what equity is, we have an issue. And so I understand equity as a corrective fix, as work that we're doing to deliver equitable outcomes. So it's not just about giving everyone the same opportunity, the same chance, so that's part of it. Equity is also about recognizing the fact that many people have different histories, different barriers, different situations that affect their ability to go the distance. And so unless we're talking about equitable outcomes, we can do all the things on the front end we want, but it does not guarantee that we're all going to land in the same place. And so a big part of my work is to work with cabinet chiefs and department heads to pull up this intersectional understanding of what equity is. Racial equity, health equity, and economic equity and inclusion. And so working with chiefs to help identify not only what equity means, but also, Lois, what people understand as their priority policies in this area. And then working to actually take those ideas and to walk outside the building. And so for the first 30 days, I'll be doing a lot of internal work, table setting, if you will, to help us understand what equity is, to help us learn a little bit from what I have learned from other cities. So Boston is not the first city to launch a Chief of Equity. I've been teaching for the last couple of years to see what this work looks like in other places. Did some teaching at MIT, and so happy to bring this understanding to the hall. First, setting up this idea of, again, what are we talking about? and then doing some real work around aligning our policies and initiatives around what we say we're doing as an institution. And that's a really exciting work because the next 30 days will really be spent outside of the building, talking more to our partners in the private sector, folks in the healthcare world, in the education world, to think with them about how they can help fill in some of the gaps. And so it's really meant to be a citywide vision, a citywide work. And so beginning within the building and then walking out the door. So I'm very, very excited and really delighted that the mayor has had such incredible vision and leadership to make way for this important work.
Well, it sounds like in many instances you'll be working across departments. Which departments and what will that look like?
Absolutely, all of them. So
Okay.
this is meant to really get at the root of systemic racism and all of the city's policies and regulations. And so all departments come to bear because all departments serve the people of Boston. And so this is work that is comprehensive and will cover all agencies, functions, and departments in the hall.
So, our city's most vulnerable are a major concern. For instance, I've spoken with Yusufi Vali. He is
Yes,
he heads up the Office for Immigrant
which is
Advancement.
part of my cabinet. Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so yeah, he's a wonderful, passionate, well-educated, wonderful man. We had great conversation. So, how will your new office be able to assist
Sure.
with
Well,
his?
absolutely. Well, the Office of Immigrant Advancement is one of the 6 departments that is in the cabinet, and so my cabinet includes this office, includes the Office of Women's Advancement, includes the Office of Diversity, includes the Office of Language and Communications Access, also includes the Office of Resilience and Racial Equity, and really trying to think through kind of all of this host of departments and who are the populations that they serve, and what else do they need. So particularly for Yusufi's work with our immigrant populations, my job is to really lift up what we know is working. And so Yusufi's work is an exceptional example of work that is frontline work, that is serving many of the populations that our city not only depends on, but is meant to serve. I mean, Boston has an incredibly rich immigrant community that is core, part and parcel to our neighborhoods, our streets, our schools, and businesses. And so it is up to us to put these frontline populations right in our crosshairs in terms of what are the policies that we're making, what are the regulations, what are the budget decisions that we're making to make sure these populations can be prioritized. And Yusufi has been an incredible advocate and champion and executive delivering on this work for a while now. So my work is to support him.
So, one of the things that's happened new here in Boston, a newly created Boston Racial Equity Fund. I believe your office is going to head that. And so, what are the first steps in coordinating that new fund?
Absolutely. So when the mayor launched the Boston Racial Equity Fund, the vision was really to create a new kind of a tool that had some independence from the city's budget cycle. So a place where finances and investments could sit to think about, again, racial inequity, health inequities, also economic inequities and exclusion, and to say, how can we imagine this fund as a way to think about long-term change? And so the mayor has been really laser focused on this idea of a 50-year vision, a 50-year impact. And, Lois, when he said it, I kind of did a double take because I thought, did he say 15? 1, 5?
1550.
Seems like a long time. But to know that he was imagining a 50-year impact of this
Yes.
kind of investment is pretty stunning. And so when you talk about 50 years, what you're talking about is generational change.
Mm.
You're talking about trying to imagine Boston way, way into the future, where some of the conditions and some of the health determinants that we're dealing with and some of the economic realities can be transcended in a way to expand and increase life expectancy, to increase economic outcomes in a way that is transformative. healing and whole making. And so that's the kind of vision that the fund has been created around. And we're still in the early stages of trying to think through members of the steering committee, a bunch of folks who have come on board saying they want to help really guide the vision around what the fund could be. But it's quite different from something like the Boston Resiliency Fund, or even what we remember as the One Boston Fund. So these were funds that were created in a moment of crisis, right? Certainly the One
Right.
Boston Fund in response to the marathon bombings, the Boston Resiliency Fund in response to the acute crisis that we're having around the coronavirus pandemic. And so what you're doing is you're standing up a big fund, you're trying to get a bunch of people together to really address an immediate problem, and then the fund goes away. So the Racial Equity Fund is quite different in the sense that we have a much longer term view of the nature of the issues that we're trying to address. And so we're going to take some time to set this fund up, to do some research, to pull some people together, because the mayor is absolutely committed to getting it right. So
How best
very
to spend
excited.
that money. Yeah. And in fact,
Very excited to have this as a new tool.
individuals, businesses, organizations, they all can contribute, they can donate. So simply, I think this is a good time that we can put on the screen perhaps your email or website address, phone numbers where someone can make a phone call and connect and perhaps see how they can best assist and donate. And nothing too small, right? No donation too small.
Yeah, that's right. We welcome it all. Thank you so much
Okay.
for that plug.
Well, I'd also, right now, I'd like to share with our audience a small part of your speech during the press conference that we referenced earlier, where you were introduced by Mayor Walsh.
For far too long, Boston City Hall has been an agent of racism, exclusion, and old crony gatekeeping of the city's prosperity and power. Not recognizing your abilities, not recognizing your contributions, not recognizing your skills, not recognizing your leadership, not recognizing your power, your voice, your rights. Today is a somber day to recognize this painful and enduring truth. Today is also a day to state a new kind of pledge to listen and move toward change.
All right, so Doctor, those are very strong words. So tell us, what are some of the systemic barriers that you see as our biggest issues here in Boston?
Sure. We have a city that's proud of its history, proud of our longer story in terms of being not only this home of American liberation and the fight for revolution, but this story of this breakaway nation, how we're able to break loose of British imperialism and to really codify a new vision of what democratic republicanism could be. So not to sound like I am trying to take an outtake from Hamilton, the musical, but really trying to think about what it means to create freedom, personal freedom, safety, health, and happiness. That is the core of our nation and our city. And our city is so center stage in that kind of a story that we have a paradox, right? So we have this story of this ongoing quest for freedom and liberation. And so we can certainly speak to the fight against slavery. Abolition has a really important home here. I can think of folks like Frederick Douglass. I can think of folks like Harriet Tubman. I can think of William Lloyd Garrison, just incredible stories and actors that are rooted right here. And then on the other side of that, we can talk about, again, some of the racial oppression in our own city and in our story, fighting against things like the Fugitive Slave Act, fighting against things like 100 and many years later, the work to integrate public schools. And so this kind of turbulent racial history that we have is still very much embedded in our institutions. And so City Hall is just one of these institutions that have really struggled with Boston's history of racial reconciliation. The schools, our business sector, what it means to produce prosperity and well-being in an equitable way for the entire city is a real struggle. And so the private sector has work to do. City government has work to do. Again, the healthcare sector has work to do there. And so as someone who is a lover of history, as someone who is a teacher of history, I'm very aware of how these institutions and actors have really made it hard for many families, and families like mine who came from other places. My family came to Boston from West Virginia in hopes of finding a new home, a home full of promise and opportunity. And my family did not find that when they got here. They found a city that was very closed to them, a city that was filled with a bunch of racial barriers that made it difficult for them to find appropriate housing, jobs, and even opportunities for their children and grandchildren. And so I know that struggle firsthand from my own family. I know that struggle from history books. I know that struggle from the data that speaks to us all the time, including the Federal Reserve Bank. Federal Reserve Bank's well-known study, The Color of Wealth, and the fact that we know we still have a 10 times factor between the wealth of white families and Black families. And so that figure that we know too well, $247,000 for a white family versus $8 for a Black family, these are eye-popping figures. And so we know that even when we control for education or we control for home ownership or jobs, we still have a gap, a delta. And so there's something about the longevity and the stubbornness of racism and its legacy that is affecting not only our institutions and how they function, but also, again, the outcomes of communities all across the city. And so that's very much what is in the center of my portfolio, the center of my vision, and the center of what the mayor understands in terms of what it will take to get this work done.
So we discussed earlier the of what's going on today, and what we are now living in a time where much activism has been triggered. So in your mind, do you think that will help drive this systemic change that we're looking for?
Yeah, well, we're watching it, right? And
Yeah.
so certainly in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder, a horrific event that we all witnessed. Many of us who clicked that video saw a Black man being murdered at the hands of state-sanctioned violence, at the hands of a police officer. And so a traumatizing visual, a halting visual, one that has very much pricked the consciousness of many others who would not imagine such a sight. And so for many folks who are in the street, this is a wake-up call for some and a sobering reminder for others who are saying enough is enough. And so we find ourselves in a moment where public opinion is demanding more, is demanding change, demanding racial reconciliation and justice in a way that is bringing about, it seems like, a tidal wave of conversation, of policy making, of discussion and grappling in city government, for sure, right here in Boston, in governments across the country, in the private sector, in the education sector, where I also sit. Folks are really in a moment of reckoning. And so your question about what this might mean, and is this different, or will it lead to change, is the right question. And I believe we have a moral obligation to make change happen, which is to bring people into commitment, not just into reaction to something that has been horrific and traumatic, but to take that feeling and turn it into plans, turn it into policy, turn it into investments that can eventually, and hopefully sooner than not, lead to this generational change that young people are seeking and that they deserve. And so this is that moment for us to make true, not just not make true just on something that we've just seen that needs to be corrected, to kind of be a witness, but to think about all the history, again, that has brought us to this moment. And so unfortunately, George Floyd's murder is not the first. There's a longer story here. I think what folks on the street are really fighting for is the desire to make it be the last, and to say, how can we stop this epidemic of killing of unarmed people, and particularly unarmed Black people, since it really gets to the heart of anti-Black racism and its pernicious and enduring legacy.
Well, in fact, here in our very own city, Mayor Walsh has publicly announced his commitment. We're going to listen to some of his words about that.
Before I bring up Dr. Karilyn Crockett as our first Chief Equity Officer, she asked me a question the other day, and she said, I'm honored to be asked about this role, but she said, what's your commitment in this work? And what I said to her was, my door is open, literally open, and any time that she has a question or an obstacle or a barrier that needs to be torn down, we will tear it down together.
Doctor, can you please talk a little bit about your background? In fact, I appreciate you sharing the West Virginia story. My father's from West Virginia, so
Oh,
I don't
wonderful.
meet
No
too many
kidding.
people from West Virginia
It's
very
true.
often. Yeah.
It's true.
I mean, when my father grew up, they didn't have electricity, running water where he grew up. They didn't even have a zip code
Wow.
till many, many, many years later.
Yeah,
So,
these West Virginia stories are serious. Yes.
yes, so it's definitely
Lots
a different. I don't meet too many people in Boston who families come from West Virginia.
right,
So,
right.
but I'd
So,
love to hear a little bit more about your background. I know you're from Dorchester. You grew up there, went to school through high school, I believe.
yeah,
So tell us a little bit about that background, your
yeah.
work experiences, and your education. I think all of these things are coming together, and it's why you're in place where you are right now. So
Mm.
I'd love to hear a little bit more about it.
Sure. No, you're exactly right. I am born and raised in Dorchester, a proud dot rat. I guess I'm supposed to say Dorchester as the biggest neighborhood, the best neighborhood, the most diverse neighborhood, the most land mass, all of that Dorchester pride and love I have.
Yeah.
And as a neighborhood kid, grew up loving my neighborhood, playing hide and seek, playing in the fire hydrants, just all the regular things that neighborhood kids do in Boston. And I think that it's a special experience growing up here because of the rootedness of our community, street by street and block by block. And so I definitely grew up nurtured and nestled in all of that. And it probably wasn't until a bit later in high school that I began to see the rest of the city. So I did go to public school until about eighth grade. And then I was recruited to private school, and so went to private school in the city, girls' school, the Windsor School, which was wonderful. And it was then that I got to see more of what Boston was. And I think in terms of the city's cultural institutions and some of the different educational riches that we have, even as a school that's right close to Simmons College. So it was like my first experience to kind of a college world. And it kind of raised questions for me to say, well, my neighborhood is wonderful and my community there is great, but then there's this bigger city. There's this thing called Boston, which feels a little bit different. And so I think that, again, is not unusual, sort of neighborhood kids realizing that there's this place called home that could be your neighborhood or your street. And then there's this other thing called Boston. And so the question is, how do they fit together? And so those questions have really informed my professional path. And so when I finished with college, I came back home and started a nonprofit called My Town, a multicultural youth tour of what's now, which is an organization that was all about helping young people, neighborhood kids from the city, learn about their family story, their family's history, and the story of their neighborhood, and sort of teaching those stories to the public. So we saw ourselves as the other side of the Freedom Trail story, or the other side of the city's kind of colonial Tea Party, John Hancock narrative, to a more contemporary story. So that experience was incredible and really gave me a hunger for understanding everyday resident stories and histories, and seeing how much that could be a tool for understanding not only how we got here, but also the future of the city. So did a bunch of grad school on the other side of that experience.
A whole lot from what I read.
Probably too much. Yeah, studied geography and economics in London, really trying to understand about place and resource flows, and then did a study of ethics because it seemed like so much of what is at stake in our country is not just do we have the money for things because we do have money. I studied markets and market capitalism. I could say we have money, but the question often is, do we have the will? Do we have the will to make change? Do we have the will to bring justice about? And so my study of ethics really kind of helped inform that. And then sort of bringing it full circle to the study of culture and cities and trying to understand how cities are so vital for not only charting the direction for people who live in cities, but for also charting the direction of the country. And so a robust set of studies and research in grad school that has really put me back into this conversation around policy. And so when I came back home again from grad school, it was just at the time where Mayor Walsh was running. And so on the other side of his successful election, he's coming into office in 2014, and there's an opportunity to think about would I want to join this new administration? And so Chief Del Barros reached out to me and asked if I would want to join the Office of Economic Development. And at the time, I really didn't know much about government, and I was sort of skeptical because I felt like I didn't really know enough myself, and I still have my own questions about government and its efficacy. But I eventually said yes, and it was wonderful. And so for 4 years, I was the director of economic research and policy, and I also directed the work of the city's small business team in office. And so an incredible opportunity to be in the front seat of an administration coming into being, coming into power, and to really understand the heart and the intention and the vision of Mayor Walsh, which is an incredible source of inspiration then and now. So wonderful to be back here. I'm not new to City Hall, but I am new to thinking about this work at this scale. And so it feels like a true honor and a privilege to be here.
And it's been a privilege talking with you as well. Dr. Karilyn Crockett, we really thank you so much for joining us. Your list of accomplishments, it's very impressive. And
just getting started here, Louise.
We expect great things. We look forward to hearing about all of your progress. So hopefully we'll get together again very soon and discuss that. So thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Lois. Thank you.
And thank you, our viewers, for watching. Recent protests would have us believe that the city of Boston is primed for reform, ready to embrace more equitable, fair treatment in every aspect of our city life. The mayor's office is providing us with new leadership to focus on making the changes we have loudly shouted for. Now are we, the people of Boston, ready to support and follow a new challenging path. Thank you very much for joining us, and we'll see you next time on Commissioner's Corner.